Good morning, how are you? Look up on Google the Eisenhower matrix. What you do is you take your objective tasks, your to-do list, let's say, and you look at it at a given time, depending on the time period. I'm going to use my example because it's the easiest for me to use. On Sunday afternoon, I look at the week, and I start with the objective list. And you can categorize them very easily, the things that are important but not urgent, the things that are important and urgent, the things that are not important but they're urgent. Our lives are filled with that kind of stuff. And then the stuff that actually takes a lot of our time because it's easy to deal with, that's the stuff that's not important and not urgent. And that's the design of this, is that what you're supposed to do is get rid of that stuff. Either delegate it or delete it. But the stuff that's not important and not urgent is not something we should even mess with. And then you go through a structure to figure out now, of these other three, which should I attack first, second, third, and that sort of thing. One of the problems, I think, with this kind of model, if all we do is look at the objective stuff and say, here's what's urgent, here's what's not urgent, here's what's important, here's what's not important, is we only get part of the picture. And I think when you look at business models, I read a lot of business stuff and they keep referring back to this, and they always do that. They always come back to say, okay, your job requires this, therefore you should do these kinds of things. I think we miss something in that process. One of the things that we miss is, I think, to make a tool like this effective is we have to deal with our values. We always get in those situations where we're in some sort of training and somebody says, okay, what are your life values? I roll my eyes and my instinct is to say whatever it takes to get them to stop asking me the question. You know what I mean? But because I've realized how important that has become in my life, I've had to sit down and write out my values. And while I can't quote them to you every moment of every day, I've got an Evernote note that I can go to immediately, and that's kind of my compass. So when I'm looking at this kind of thing, I look at that and say, what is it that's of tremendous value to me in my life, and how does this objective stuff, how does that relate to my values? How does that relate to the stuff that I think is important to my life to make my life successful and useful and fulfilling? I would suggest to all of us that it's worth sometimes sitting back and saying what are our values, getting them in writing. Get 4 values, 5 values, something like that. You say, this is what my life really is built on. I've found that my values change as time goes forward, because things happen and you suddenly say, this is not as important to me as it once was, but this is now more important. For example, as a dad of a young family, when I first started using this 30 years ago, having time with my kids was very important to me. I made all their ball games, all their concerts. I've listened to more bad band tunes than I can ever shake a stick at, because I was a band parent. I was involved. Well, that's not a high priority for me today, because my girls are both moms now. Now spending time with the grandkids suddenly has become a value. So you see how as your life changes, your value structure changes to some degree or another. So it's always something worth going back to and saying, okay, what am I about today as opposed to what I was about 5 years ago or 10 years ago? The other thing is we don't deal with the subjective stuff enough, because really it's hard for us to know what's important and urgent. Now, I can tell you if my boss says he needs a document this afternoon, that becomes urgent. That's very tangible. But most of the stuff we deal with isn't like that. And so what causes us to evaluate a task and say, this is important, this is urgent? What causes that? Well, I would suggest that comes from our subjective, the things that are going on in our life today. Values first, but then out of that comes all the stuff that's happening. I think a lot of times when we go to our tool and say, how are we going to structure our lives? A lot of times it comes from the tyranny of the urgent, as the old phrase goes. It goes from those things that, well, I've just got to get it done because somebody says here's a deadline, and really, frankly, I don't even care about this. I don't even know why I'm doing this job because I really don't like it. We all think that on occasion. But I think if we look at our value structure and then we go to the subjective stuff and get in touch with where are we emotionally and spiritually at this moment, that helps us decide what's important. And you can't do that without spending time in the presence of God and letting Him speak to our hearts, His words for us. And his time of saying, okay, here's what I think about what's going on in your life. And I began to mull over the sovereignty of God, and then that begins to speak about what my life should be like and what the situations of my life really are in terms of that. Now, you may have other things that you go to help you really get a grip on who God is in your life. What characteristic of God is important to you? There was a period of time in my life when I didn't really care that much about the sovereignty of God. It wasn't all that important because I was young and I had the world by the tail and I'd been trained and I knew what I was doing and just let me at it. But as I got older and more things happened that seemed to be out of God's control and certainly out of my control, I learned to value the sovereignty of God. And the fact that, I love saying this, He doesn't have a red spot on His forehead from going, who would have thought? He always knows. It's always in control. He's always in control, even though it doesn't seem like that. We're not always healed in this life. Our bodies still are failing at every moment. I've wrestled with that with Becky's situations and said, God, you could heal her right now. And that makes it even worse because we know He could and He doesn't. But that's not what He promises. He doesn't promise that we're going to have enough money in our checking account to write a check for anything we want. Oh, nobody writes checks anymore. Use our ATM card for anything we want. He says, I'll take care of you. But He says there's coming a time when your bodies will be whole. There's coming a time when relationships will be healed. There's coming a time when every need will not only be met, but that abundance will be evident and not just something we hold on to. That's our hope. So I think when we go to this kind of thing, we have to not start there. We have to start with, where am I today? What do I need from God today? Well, who do I need God to be today to deal with what's coming my way? Then when we get our spiritual and emotional lives together, then we've got a clear enough path to be able to say, now I can evaluate the week or the month or whatever I'm planning and say, now I can evaluate it clearly. I do this, as I said, on Sunday. And the reason I do it on Sunday is because a while ago my values changed a bit. I always had trouble with the concept of Sabbath. So the Lord said, you know what, Steve, here's what Sabbath means to you. On Sunday, you go to church, whether you're speaking or whether you're just attending. When you get home, you spend time with Becky, and you don't work. You don't go to the garage. I've got several projects out there. And I found that by Sunday afternoon, my spirit is at rest. Because I've been in fellowship with believers, and I've heard something of the Word. I've had an opportunity to worship God. And it's gotten my eyes focused on really, who am I in His eyes? And what does He really want me to do with my life? And I think that if I had an encouragement for all of us, myself included, is that. Use a tool like this, because you can't be organized in your life without a tool. It just doesn't work. And there's a million tools like this. I happen to like versions of this. But the second step is make sure you know what your values are in your life. What do I really treasure and value for my life? And the third thing is make sure you're really aware of where you are emotionally and spiritually and deal with that with God. Put it at the foot of the throne and make sure He then is able to answer you with that characteristic, that quality of His that reflects your need. And then after that, you can do all the planning you need to do and you'll be more effective and probably produce more fruit for the kingdom.